And today we're going to discuss something that's most likely inside of you right now, but most of us have no idea it's even there unless something goes wrong. And well, as the title of the video suggests, we're going to be discussing this very tiny organ inside our bodies referred to as the vermiform appendix, or just appendix for short. And for a very long time, including basically most of my educational life, the standard scientific narrative was that this was basically something that's not particularly useful, or that this small worm-shaped tube was a kind of an evolutionary leftover, something biologists refer to as vestigiality or a vestigial organ, with appendix basically being the first entry if you look up this concept. And surprisingly, most of this seems to be the result of the explanations and various propositions by Charles Darwin. Interestingly, you can actually read all of this for free in one of the links in the description because all of his books are publicly available. And so in this section, The Bodily Structure of Man, he explains that this very small tubular pouch, roughly the size of a typical finger, and a pouch that seems to branch off from the organ referred to as cecum, essentially the beginning of the large intestine, is a kind of a vestige, a remnant from our ancestors who very likely consumed a lot of leaves and a lot of vegetable matter, something that required a much larger large intestine in order to ferment tough vegetation. Or essentially, the proposition here was that our ancestors were a lot more vegetarian and thus required more intestine space. And so in his 1871 work, The Descent of Man, Darwin argues that as we shifted to more easily digestible food, this structure shrank, leaving us with a kind of a leftover referred to as the appendix, a non-functional extra part. And well, this was the consensus that dominated both science and medicine for over a century. Because of this, we were all taught that the appendix is definitely not essential and you're not going to miss it if it's removed, with appendicitis basically becoming a somewhat common procedure in serious emergencies involving a serious infection of this part. As a matter of fact, just as a side note, I remember reading that a lot of scientists going to, for example, Antarctica, had to have this procedure done before they were allowed to fly in and perform research in these remote locations. And that's because there were several cases where some of the researchers living on the base actually did have a very serious infection of the appendix, with at least one medical doctor required to actually perform the surgery on himself without any anesthetics. This was actually back in 1961 when a 27-year-old Leonid Rogozov successfully removed his own appendix because he was the only doctor on the base. And you can read a little bit more about all of this in one of the links in the description. And so because of this, removing appendix was required for many different professions in a lot of different remote locations, simply because having it was actually more dangerous than not having it. And that's because in some cases, if it gets clogged by something, such as for example feces, or if it becomes infected, it can swell and burst and spread a lot of bacteria into the abdominal cavity, leading to a very serious problem. And so as a result, in just the last year or so, US alone performed approximately 300,000 different surgeries involving the removal of appendix. But based on some of the more recent studies from the last few years, researchers and medical practitioners started to discover that, well, we might have been kind of wrong about its uselessness, with at least several large-scale studies, including the one we're going to be discussing today, basically rewriting the story and suggesting that its presence might even be a significant evolutionary advantage. And well, I guess let's start with the overall misconception. Just because you can survive without something, it doesn't mean that it does not have a function. And well, a lot of this started with a major breakthrough in 2007. This is when researchers at Duke University proposed that appendix seems to be a kind of a safe house for a lot of beneficial gut bacteria. Okay, let me explain this. Imagine your gut as a kind of a very busy city involving different organisms that all interact with one another. This is a delicate ecosystem of microbes, fungi, viruses, and archaea that essentially help you digest food and also fight off a lot of different pathogens. You can learn about this concept of microbiome in one of the videos in the description, but just to summarize some of these discoveries, there are trillions and trillions of different things inside of you right now that make your life just a little bit easier. But when you get a severe illness, like for example cholera or dysentery, it can result in a major flushing of your digestive system, with most of these helpful bacteria eventually lost. And the thing is, when this happens, there's a very high chance that your gut can then be settled by somewhat more dangerous bacteria that can then make life very miserable. But this organ, the appendix, seems to be relatively narrow and resemble a kind of a tube tucked away from the main flow inside the digestive tract. So basically here it's actually protected from a lot of these dangerous infections, mostly because it's kind of isolated. And so instead it seems to act as a kind of a reservoir for many of these beneficial and good bacteria to take shelter. And so after the illness passes, a lot of bacteria from here seem to emerge and then spread across the intestine in almost no time. And though at first this was just a proposition and I guess just a hypothesis, eventually a lot of medical data provided needed support. And so for example in this 2012 study, scientists confirmed that individuals without an appendix were a lot more likely to suffer from certain intestinal issues, specifically a recurrence of something known as Clostridioides difficile colitis, a severe and often chronic gut infection that seems to result in much worse condition in people whose appendix has been removed. Which basically confirms that without this safe house, the body has a much harder time restoring its natural microbial balance. With researchers also confirming that the appendix evolved independently at least 32 times in various mammalian lineages. And in comparison, it was only lost 7 times, implying that it could potentially be useful. And these studies basically refute Darwin's proposition. Here they strongly suggest that appendix is not a vestigial organ, and its persistence in evolutionary terms, and also its independent evolution, indicates it seems to provide adaptive advantage. But exactly what the advantage is still unclear. For example, the study also discovers that there seems to be no link to diet. There's no correlation between this being some kind of a herbivore thing or carnivore thing, or that this is related to fermentation as Darwin suggested. This also has no link to social structure or any social activity, with the size of the appendix being correlated with the size of the overall colon. Basically, the larger the intestine, the larger the appendix. While at the same time, researchers also discovered that this is not just a bacterial reservoir, but it's also important for our immune system, and especially during childhood. It seems to contain a very high concentration of gut-associated lymphoid tissue that serves as a kind of a training ground for many different white blood cells like B and T cells, to learn how to fight infection. So basically think of it as a kind of a school for your white cells to learn how to protect you from infection for the rest of your life. And so early in life, this particular tissue helps the entire immune system to distinguish between harmless, friendly microbes and dangerous invading pathogens, which once again confirms that it seems to be super important. It basically makes this not a vestigial organ, but instead an adaptive specialized organ that seems to be quite widespread in various mammalian groups. And so here, by mapping the entire mammalian family tree, researchers confirm that out of 360 species, this seems to have evolved independently 32 times. And this is basically your textbook definition or even Darwinian definition of convergent evolution. Essentially when nature tries to invent the same structure over and over because it seems to be very beneficial. And that's despite the fact that appendicitis or the infection of appendix can be pretty dangerous, with one of the most recent studies even confirming a direct correlation between the presence of appendix and the greater maximal longevity in various mammals. Or, once again to rephrase this, having this appendix makes animals live longer. But if it is so beneficial, why does it sometimes try to kill us? So this brings us to a concept of evolutionary medicine. And so here let's, think about what humans used to be like back in the days. For most of our history, our ancestors lived in very dirty environments with poor sanitation and a high chance for a diarrheal pathogen that could basically result in a major problem or even death. And in that world, an organ that can quickly restore your microbiome following an infection is a massive lifesaver. Basically, once the infection stops, being able to have a healthy gut once again was extremely beneficial. But in a modern industrialized world, where we have clean water, antibiotics, and high sanitation, we don't need to flush out our pathogens nearly as often. Which means that the appendix suddenly does become kind of vestigial because it does not have much to do. And on top of this, the change in diet, and especially the Western diet, that's very often low in fiber, can also form what's known as a fecalith, a hardened deposit that can block the appendix and then trigger inflammation. And so in most cases, it's really the poor diet that usually results in the infection of the appendix. And all of this seems to be the result of this modern world that creates a kind of a mismatch between what Appendix is meant for and what it seems to receive. And though this is just a hypothesis, it is more or less confirmed by data. And that's because we see a very high rate of appendicitis in developed countries, but this almost never happens in non-human animals or in populations eating very high fiber diets in non-Western countries. And so basically here this is just the result of a kind of an evolutionary mismatch. A mismatch between the ancient biology that evolved this organ and the modern world that basically makes it a little bit inefficient. And though today we technically can live without it, mostly thanks to modern medicine and sanitation, it still remains a relatively functional part of the immune system and is still quite important in the digestive system in order to provide for a healthy microbiome. With all this implying that these organs seem to be deeply integrated in our bodies and in much more complex ways than we ever imagined or ever thought. And though Darwin was obviously right about a lot of things, here he seemed to be just a little bit incorrect. And that's because we're only now beginning to understand how many of these organs seem to function. But we'll definitely come back and discuss all of this in some of the future videos, including videos on the gut microbiome, where scientists have made a lot of incredible discoveries in just the last few months. On that note, thank you for watching, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support this channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads and can DM me directly, or by joining a channel membership that grants you early access. You can also support this channel by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.